Hans Christian Andersen grew up with a heart full of dreams so fragile and vivid that reality often felt too narrow to contain them, causing his imagination to stretch far beyond the small rooms, quiet streets, and modest expectations surrounding his early life. He was born in 1805 in the Danish city of Odense, a place of cobblestone paths, humble houses, and whispered folktales, where poverty lingered gently but persistently in the background of everyday survival. His father was a shoemaker with a love for books and stories, while his mother worked tirelessly to keep the household afloat, creating a childhood balanced between tenderness, hardship, and an aching desire for something more. From an early age, Hans showed an unusual sensitivity, responding deeply to music, theater, and language, as though every sound and word carried emotional weight far heavier than others seemed to notice. He often felt different from other children, not quite fitting into games, routines, or rough play, preferring instead to imagine worlds where objects spoke, animals felt sorrow, and overlooked souls mattered deeply. Stories became his refuge, because within them he could be brave, admired, and understood, even when real life offered little reassurance or praise. Despite limited schooling and frequent loneliness, Hans absorbed tales, songs, and myths with remarkable intensity, storing them like hidden treasures inside his restless mind. He dreamed of the stage, believing that acting or singing might lift him out of poverty and carry him toward recognition, belonging, and applause. As a teenager, he left Odense for Copenhagen with little money and enormous hope, carrying dreams so large they nearly outweighed his confidence. The city did not greet him kindly because talent alone did not protect him from rejection, hunger, and disappointment. His attempts at acting and singing failed repeatedly, not due to lack of passion, but because his voice and presence never quite matched expectations. Teachers, critics, and patrons often doubted him, finding him awkward, overly sensitive, or impractical. Yet even rejection fed his imagination, shaping emotions that would later bloom into unforgettable stories. Through perseverance and occasional support from kind mentors, Hans slowly found his way into writing, discovering that words obeyed him more gently than stages ever had. At first, he struggled with grammar and structure, forcing him to learn patiently and persistently. Rather than copying classical forms perfectly, he listened closely to spoken language, rhythm, and emotion. He realized that the most powerful stories sounded simple, even when they carried deep sorrow and meaning beneath the surface. Folktales inspired him, but he reshaped them boldly, mixing humor, sadness, wonder, and honesty into something entirely his own. His stories gave voices to tin soldiers, ugly ducklings, lonely mermaids, and broken toys, characters who mirrored his own feelings of being misunderstood and overlooked. Unlike traditional fairy tales that always promised happiness, Andersen allowed pain, sacrifice, and longing to exist openly. He believed children deserved emotional truth rather than false comfort. His writing style flowed like conversation, inviting readers into a quiet, intimate world rather than dazzling them with spectacle. At times, his humor appeared gentle and playful, yet it often carried sharp insight beneath its warmth. Hans wrote not only for children, but for the childlike parts of adults who still remembered loneliness and hope. As his fairy tales spread, readers recognized themselves within his fragile characters. Success arrived slowly, yet steadily, as audiences across Europe began sharing his stories. Despite growing fame, Hans remained emotionally sensitive, easily wounded by criticism or perceived rejection. Praise lifted him, while doubt shook him deeply, keeping his emotions in constant motion. Travel became another source of inspiration, exposing him to landscapes, cultures, and people who expanded his imagination. He recorded thoughts, feelings, and observations obsessively, transforming daily experiences into creative material. His notebooks overflowed with ideas, half-formed tales, and reflections on beauty, suffering, and belonging. Hans believed suffering sharpened insight, though he often wished he could escape it. His friendships were complicated, filled with admiration, misunderstanding, and longing. Through writing, he found control over emotions that otherwise overwhelmed him. Each story became a mirror of his inner life, reflecting hope tangled tightly with sadness. His fairy tales grew richer, deeper, and more daring with time. He refused to simplify emotions, believing complexity honored readers more fully. Children laughed at talking objects, while adults quietly recognized deeper truths. The world slowly learned that fairy tales could carry serious emotional power. Hans Christian Andersen was shaping something entirely new. His journey was still unfolding, filled with struggle, imagination, and quiet determination. And the boy who once felt invisible was only beginning to be heard. As Hans Christian Andersen matured, his stories expanded beyond gentle wonder and playful fantasy, gradually embracing deeper emotional shadows, as though his imagination had learned that light felt brighter only when shaped carefully beside sorrow and longing. The more he wrote, the more clearly readers sensed that his fairy tales were not simple bedtime amusements, but emotional journeys where vulnerability, sacrifice, and quiet courage mattered as much as magic or happy endings. Works like The Little Mermaid revealed his belief that love could be beautiful and painful at the same time, because longing sometimes demanded loss rather than reward, especially for those brave enough to follow their hearts. In The Ugly Duckling, Andersen transformed childhood loneliness into a universal story of patience and self-discovery, reminding readers that belonging often arrives late and unexpectedly, yet feels powerful when it finally appears. As fame grew across Europe, invitations, praise, and recognition followed him, yet inner uncertainty never fully released its grip on his sensitive spirit. He traveled constantly, moving through grand cities and quiet towns, observing people, listening closely to conversations, and absorbing emotional details that later resurfaced in carefully shaped stories. Despite success, Andersen often felt like an outsider, uncomfortable among aristocrats and intellectuals, unsure whether admiration reflected genuine connection or polite distance. His sensitivity, once a source of hardship, became the emotional engine of his writing, sharpening his ability to notice subtle feelings others ignored. Critics debated his work fiercely, some praising its honesty and imagination, while others questioned its sadness and emotional weight for children. Andersen responded not with arguments, but with more stories, believing that emotion spoke more clearly than defense. His fairy tales continued evolving, blending realism, imagination, humor, and melancholy into a voice that felt intimate and unmistakably his own. He wrote about emperors blinded by pride, nightingales forgotten after mechanical perfection appeared, and matches flaring briefly against cold indifference. Each tale carried layered meaning, allowing children to enjoy fantasy while adults quietly reflected on truth. Andersen never aimed to lecture, choosing instead to invite empathy through experience rather than instruction. His language remained simple, yet emotionally precise, proving that depth did not require complexity of words. The older he grew, the more his stories echoed reflections on aging, memory, and the passage of time. Illness and loneliness shadowed his later years, but writing remained his most faithful companion. He poured gratitude, fear, hope, and regret into his work, shaping stories that felt both personal and timeless. Andersen often worried about being forgotten, despite widespread fame, revealing a heart that never fully believed in permanence. Yet generations of readers proved his fears unnecessary, returning again and again to his tales for comfort and understanding. His fairy tales crossed languages and cultures, adapting effortlessly because their emotions felt universal. Children laughed at clever details, while adults paused thoughtfully at endings that refused easy comfort. Andersen showed that fairy tales could be brave enough to admit sadness without losing wonder. He expanded storytelling itself, proving that imagination could address real human struggles gently and honestly. When Andersen grew weak with age, memories replaced travel as his primary journey. He reflected often on his childhood, recognizing how hardship had quietly shaped his creative strength. The boy who once dreamed of applause had instead found something deeper and more enduring. His stories became companions to the lonely, the misunderstood, and the hopeful. When Hans Christian Andersen died in 1875, the world mourned not just a writer, but a storyteller who had redefined emotional honesty in fantasy. His legacy did not rest in statues or grand speeches, but in whispered readings shared between generations. Fairy tales once dismissed as childish gained newfound respect through his influence. Today, Andersen's stories remain alive, retold in classrooms, homes, and quiet moments before sleep. His characters continue speaking for those who feel unseen. They remind readers that sensitivity can be strength, that gentleness can endure, that imagination offers shelter during hardship, and that truth does not always shine brightly, yet it still guides faithfully. Hans Christian Andersen taught the world that even fragile voices can travel far. His life proved that stories born from vulnerability can outlast noise. And if we listen closely, his fairy tales still whisper that hope often arrives wearing sorrow, yet carries beauty inside.